Welcome to Auntie Sermons, the podcast. I'm your host and your Auntie, Crystal J. I write and perform every episode of Auntie Sermons, the podcast. This is the podcast that decenters men and asks women to step up and take the mic. Together, we are moving methodically and chronologically through the Bible, telling the story of every named and unnamed woman in sermon format. And yes, we are glorifying them because for far too long, their stories have been minimized, weaponized, or erased altogether. Here, we ask the questions patriarchy never wanted us asking. Why were they here? Who benefited from the way their stories were told? Who benefited from their silence? And who benefited from their erasure? So grab yourself something to drink, get comfortable, and make sure you've got your Bible, your notepad, and your highlighter ready. Let's get into it. Auntie Sermons, episode 14, Keturah, the Forgotten Wife. Everybody knows the story of Abraham and Sarah. Many know about Hagar, but almost nobody talks about Keturah, Abraham's last wife, the woman who came after the promise, the woman who came after the covenant, the woman history folded up and tucked into the back pages. Who was she? Why is she here? And why has her story been treated like an appendix instead of a chapter? Today, we dig her up, dust her off, and put her back into the story and learn from her. So let's get into it. Auntie Sermons, episode 14, Keturah, the Forgotten Wife. Genesis 25:1. Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. Let's slow down for a minute, because there's a woman here that most people have never even noticed. Her name is Keturah. That's it. That's the introduction. The text simply says that Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. And if you spent any time around church, you already know the problem. You've heard about Abraham and Sarah your entire life. Their story is told like some great biblical romance. The faithful couple, the chosen pair, the miracle baby. But right there in Genesis, after Sarah dies, the text quietly tells us that Abraham marries another woman. Her name is Keturah. And suddenly, the man who spent decades supposedly struggling to produce an heir goes on to have 6 more sons with this woman. 6. Their names are Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, Shua. Entire nations will come from those sons, tribes that will show up all over the biblical world, and yet most people sitting in pews today have never heard her name spoken out loud. In Hebrew, her name is Keturah. Most scholars connect this name to the Hebrew root katar, which means to burn incense or to produce fragrant smoke. From the same root comes the word keteret, the word used in the Hebrew Bible for sacred incense burned in ritual spaces. So when ancient readers heard the name Keturah, they would have heard something associated with incense, fragrance, and rising smoke. And maybe that's the strange irony of this woman, because the story barely pauses to notice her, but her descendants will linger across the map of the ancient world. The text gives her almost nothing, just a name and a list of sons. But sometimes the smallest introductions are the ones that hide the biggest questions. Why is she here? Where she appears? Keturah doesn't move through the story the way other women do. She doesn't get scenes we can sit in. She doesn't get a voice we can follow. What she gets are mentions, and they come quickly. Genesis 25:1, Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. That's her entrance. Genesis 25:2, she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Her body gives the story 6 more sons. Genesis 25:4. The sons of Midian, Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah, all these were the children of Keturah. The text keeps going, not with her, but with what came from her. And then just a few verses later, the direction of the story becomes clear. Genesis 25:5 and 6. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. He sent them away from Isaac his son while he yet lived eastward to the east country. Her sons are named, her sons become nations, and her sons are sent away. Out of the center, out of the inheritance, out of the story we're meant to follow. And then she appears one more time. 1 Chronicles 1, verses 32 and 33. Now the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. The sons of Jokshan, Sheba, and Dedan. The sons of Midian, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Elda. All these were the sons of Keturah. Not as a woman, not as a story, as a record, as a line, as a name attached to descendants. That's how the text holds her. She appears, she produces, she is recorded, and then the narrative moves on while everything that came from her keeps moving through the background, just like her name, just like her fragrance. Synopsis. Keturah enters the story late after Abraham has lived an entire life already marked by promise, struggle, and inheritance. After Sarah has died, after the son of the covenant, Isaac, has already been established, then she appears. Abraham takes her as a wife, and with her there is no long struggle for children. There is no waiting, no divine intervention narrative, no tension stretched across chapters. There's simply abundance. 6 sons. Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, Shua. From those sons come peoples, tribes, regions that will exist alongside Israel throughout the rest of the biblical story. Through Keturah, Abraham becomes connected to a wider world, not just one promised line, but many surrounding peoples. And yet, the story makes a distinction. Abraham gives everything he has to Isaac. The inheritance, the promise, the center of the narrative stays with one son. Keturah's sons receive gifts, and then they are sent away. Eastward, away from Isaac, away from the center, away from the story the text chooses to follow. So Keturah becomes part of something larger, but not central. She expands the family, she multiplies the legacy, she fills the world beyond the borders of the main story, and then she disappears from it. Her role is clear in the narrative. She is not there to carry the covenant, she is there to widen the map, to connect Abraham to peoples beyond Israel, to show that his legacy did not stay contained. And even if the story did, and when her part is done, the text simply moves on. Rabbinic teachings. Now this is where the story starts to stretch, because the Bible gives us Keturah as another wife of Abraham. She appears, she bears 6 sons, she expands the family, and the text moves on. But the rabbis, they don't move on that quickly. In Genesis Rabbah, one of the earliest collections of rabbinic interpretation, and later in the writings of Rashi, a medieval Jewish commentator whose work shaped centuries of interpretation, they stop at her name and they ask, who is she really? And their answer is not what you expect. They say, Keturah is Hagar, the same Hagar, the Egyptian slave, the woman given to Abraham to produce a child, the woman who bore Ishmael, the woman who was afflicted, driven out, and left to survive in the wilderness. That Hagar. And according to this tradition, after everything that happened, she comes back. And not only does she come back, she is renamed Keturah. Now, the rabbis don't leave it there. They build a reason. They connect her name to incense, to that Hebrew word, Keturah, and they say her deeds were like incense, fragrant, acceptable, that she had bound herself, restrained herself, and not taken another partner after leaving Abraham. So now her name becomes a statement. She was faithful. She was pure. She waited for him. And I want you to hear how much work that interpretation is doing, because it takes a woman who survived exploitation and rewrites her as the ideal, the model, the woman who endured everything and still belonged to him. It takes a story about survival and turns it into a story about devotion. And yes, on the surface, it can sound like redemption, like restoration, like maybe things came back around. But look at what the story protects, because it does something very specific for Abraham. It lifts him. It cleans him. It reframes him. Because now he is not a man who participated in her suffering. Now he is the man she remained faithful to, the man she returned to, the man worth waiting for. And in that version of the story, everything that came before starts to soften. If she comes back willingly, then maybe it wasn't so bad. If she remained devoted, then maybe he didn't harm her. If she chose him, then maybe she wasn't a victim after all. Do you see how quickly that shifts? That is not a small theological move. That is a complete rewriting of power. It turns harm into loyalty. It turns survival into consent. It turns a woman's endurance into proof of a man's worth. And this is where it starts to feel less like history and more like the kind of stories we still see today. Stories where women are expected to forgive everything. Stories where endurance is praised. Stories where a woman's purity matters more than what she has been through. It starts to sound like purity culture. It starts to sound like patriarchy trying to clean up its own narrative. And not all the rabbis were comfortable with that. Ibn Ezra and Rashbam push back. They say no. Keturah is not Hagar. She is a different woman, a separate person, her own story. And that disagreement matters because it shows us that even within the tradition, there was tension. There were those who were willing to let her stand on her own. And there were those who folded her back into a story that was easier to manage, a story that kept the focus where it had always been, on the man. And in one of the most influential traditions, they chose that version. They chose to take two women and make them one. And in doing that, they didn't just reinterpret Hagar, they erased Keturah again. And the question we're left with is not just what the rabbis believed, but why that version of the story was the one that lasted. Christian teachings. Now, let's talk about what Christian traditions did with her. Because if the rabbis tried to merge her, Christian teachings tend to do something different. They acknowledge her and then they minimize her. They leave her in the text, they just don't stay with her. Most Christian commentators read this passage very straightforwardly. Yes, Abraham married Keturah after Sarah died. Yes, she bore him 6 sons. Yes, those sons became nations. And then, almost immediately, the focus shifts to what they believe actually matters. The covenant, the promise, Isaac. You can trace this pattern through commentary after commentary. In the writings of John Gill, an 18th century theologian, Keturah is acknowledged. Her sons are listed, their regions are sometimes discussed, and then the emphasis turns to the fact that they were given gifts and sent away. The real inheritance, the real theological weight stays with Isaac. In the Matthew Henry commentary, one of the most widely read devotional commentaries in Christian history, Keturah is present, but briefly. Her role is summarized quickly, and then the reader is directed back to Isaac as the child of promise, the one through whom the story is meant to continue. And you'll see this same framing repeated in modern study Bibles, sermons, and theology. Keturah's sons are other nations. Isaac is the chosen line. Keturah expands the family. Isaac defines the story, and that framing does something because she is not erased as the way we saw in some rabbinic traditions. She is acknowledged, named, recorded, but she is positioned, placed just outside the center, close enough to be included, far enough to not matter. And Christian theology builds on that structure in a very specific way. Because in Christian thought, the line of Abraham to Isaac eventually leads to Jesus. So the entire reading of Genesis becomes directional. It is moving somewhere. It is building toward something. And once that framework is in place, everything in the text starts getting sorted according to that destination. Who carries the promise? Who carries the lineage? Who connects to the outcome? And once those questions are asked, Keturah's place becomes very clear within the system. Her sons are acknowledged, but they are not followed. Their names are preserved, but their stories are not explored. Their existence is useful, but not central. And this is where it gets important, because this isn't just about theology. This is about what we are trained to pay attention to. Because when generations of people are taught to read the text this way, they learn where to look. They learn whose stories are worth sitting in. They learn whose lives are worth exploring. And they learn quietly over time whose stories are meant to be passed over. Keturah becomes part of that pattern. A woman who bears 6 sons. A woman whose descendants shape regions, trade routes, and interactions throughout the biblical world. A woman whose presence expands the scope of Abraham's legacy far beyond a single line, and yet her role is reduced to context. She becomes background information, a supporting structure that helps hold up the main story without ever becoming the story herself. And that does something to the way women are remembered, because it creates a hierarchy, a way of sorting women into categories. The woman who matters, the woman who supports, the woman who expands, the woman who disappears. And Keturah is placed firmly in that last space, not because she lacked impact, but because the narrative and the traditions that followed it chose not to center her. She is there, she is necessary, she is part of the structure, but she is not the focus. And over time, that becomes the version of her that survives. A name, a function, a footnote to someone else's story. And the question that lingers underneath all of that is this: if she wasn't the point of the story, then what was her purpose in it? Because women like Keturah weren't written for romance. They were written into systems. So what system was she part of? And what was it trying to build? And maybe more importantly, what does she want to tell us? Extra biblical teachings. Now let's step outside of the Bible for a minute, because once you leave the text itself, the story doesn't shrink, it expands. In the book of Jubilees, a text preserved in the Ethiopian biblical tradition, Keturah is not merged with anyone else. She is her own woman, a separate wife, and the story leans into what comes from her. Jubilees doesn't rush past her the way Genesis does. It takes the time to show what her presence actually does to the world around her. Because now you don't just have Isaac. You also have Ishmael and the sons of Keturah, and together they fill the map. Different regions, different peoples, different directions. The story starts to look less like one family and more like a network. And then you have Josephus, a first century Jewish historian writing in Antiquities of the Jews. And Josephus does something similar. He names her, he lists her sons, and he connects them directly to peoples living in the Arabian desert regions. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, geographically. Real places, real people, real connections. And when you put those traditions together, you start to see something that the main text only hints at. Keturah isn't just a passing character, she's a bridge, a connection point, a way of linking Abraham to a wider world beyond the central line of the story. Through her, the narrative stretches outward into trade routes, into neighboring tribes, into relationships that exist outside the covenant focus. So now the question starts to sharpen, because if these traditions are leaning into her like this, if they are expanding what comes from her instead of shrinking it, then maybe she wasn't just added to the story as an afterthought. Maybe she was doing something very specific, not just as a woman in the story, but as part of something much bigger, something being built, something being connected, something that reaches far beyond a single household. And now we're getting closer to it, why she's here and what she might actually be trying to show us. Historical context. Now, let's zoom out for a second, because what looks like a simple genealogy is doing something much bigger. Scholars have pointed out that the sons of Keturah are not random names. They are connected to real tribes, real regions, places in northwest Arabia and the surrounding desert. So when the text says that Abraham had sons through Keturah, it's not just talking about a family. It's mapping a world. And this is something Genesis does over and over again. It takes neighboring peoples and turns them into relatives. Lot becomes the ancestor of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Esau becomes the ancestor of the Edomites. And through Keturah, Abraham becomes connected to desert tribes associated with Midian and surrounding regions. So now instead of saying these are other people, the story says these are family. And that matters because family relationships are complicated. They can trade, they can marry, they can ally, they can fight, but they are never completely separate. And that's what these genealogies are doing. They are taking geography and turning it into story. They are taking politics and turning it into family. They are taking relationships between groups of of people and explaining them through shared ancestry. So when Keturah shows up in the text, she is not just there to have children. She is there to connect, to link Abraham to peoples who lived beyond the center of the story, to extend his reach into places the narrative itself doesn't fully follow. And once you see that, her role starts to come into focus. She is part of a system that is building relationships across land, across tribes, across power. And now the question isn't just why is she there? It's what kind of system would use a woman's life to build something like that? The system of marriage. Now we need to sit in this for a minute, because if we're going to talk about marriage in this story, we have to be honest about what we're actually looking at. By the time we get to Keturah, Abraham is not just old. We know from the timeline in the text that he is at least 137 years old. That's not speculation. That's the math the story gives us. And I know people like to soften that. They spiritualize it. They act like people back then aged differently. But let's be so for real. There is no evidence that ancient bodies didn't age the way ours do. Old age is old age. Wrinkled skin, slower movement, pain, weakness, a body that has lived a long time, and it shows it. That is the man this story gives us. And then it gives us Keturah, a woman who bears 6 sons. 6. And if we are being honest about cultural norms at the time, we are meant to understand something about her. If I am being conservative, she is probably around 20 years old. That's conservative. Because in that world, girls were often married younger than that. So the more honest picture is this: a very young woman paired with a man who is at least 137 years old. And that gap matters because it tells us this is not about compatibility. It is not about shared life experience. It is not about partnership. It is about function. It is about what she can produce and what the system needs from her. Because these texts do not go out of their way to describe women unless it serves a purpose. So when a woman shows up and immediately begins bearing children, we are being shown exactly why she is there. She is young, she is fertile, she is able to produce, and she is being brought into a system that is already in motion. Because by this point, the covenant line through Isaac is already secured. That part of the story is finished. So now something else begins. Expansion, connection, reach. Through Keturah, Abraham is no longer just tied to one line. He is connected outward to multiple peoples, to regions beyond the center of the story, to relationships that will exist alongside Israel for generations. And we can actually see that in the names of her sons. Zimran, likely connected to Arabian groups along trade routes, people moving goods across the desert. Jokshan, his sons include Sheba and Dedan, names tied to wealthy trading kingdoms, incense routes, gold caravans, the movement of resources across nations. Medan, associated with desert peoples, smaller tribes that existed alongside the larger powers, part of the same network. Midian, and this one matters. The Midianites show up again and again. This is where Moses flees. This is where he marries. This is where he encounters a priest who recognizes something in him. Later, the Midianites become both allies and enemies to Israel. They are not strangers. They are connected. Ishbak, another desert-associated lineage, part of the same expansion outward. Shua, linked to eastern tribes. Even the book of Job brings in Bildad the Shuhite, placing her lineage inside wisdom traditions. Do you see what's happening? These are not just sons. These are intersections, trade routes, neighboring nations, future conflicts, future alliances, places Israel will run to, places Israel will fight, places Israel will depend on. And all of it is coming through her. So when the text gives her 6 sons, it's not just telling you she had children. It is mapping influence. It is mapping connections. It is mapping a world that extends far beyond the central story. And her marriage is the mechanism that makes that happen. Not love, function. Not romance, structure. Not partnership, expansion. And this is what the system required: a young woman given to an old man to produce sons, to extend power, to build connections she would never control, and then to be remembered only as the means by which it all happened, if she is remembered at all. Cultural memory. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because even though Keturah gives birth to 6 sons, sons who become nations, sons whose names spread across regions and peoples, she is barely remembered, not erased completely, but reduced, minimized, folded into the background. When people talk about Abraham, they talk about Sarah. That is the story that gets told. That is the couple that gets remembered. That is the relationship that gets centered, repeated, honored. And Keturah becomes a footnote, a name that shows up in the genealogy and then disappears again, if she is remembered at all. And this isn't just about forgetting. It's about what fills the silence when a woman isn't centered. Because when people don't know her story, they start replacing it. They start merging her, rewriting her, folding her into someone else. And remember what we talked about earlier, those rabbinic teachings that say Keturah is actually Hagar, that she came back, that she remained faithful, that she belonged to Abraham the whole time. That idea has spread so far that many people believe it is actually in the Bible. Christians believe it. People who have left the faith believe it. Because once a woman is not clearly defined, people will define her for her. And look at what that version does. It takes a woman who was used, abused, and cast out and rewrites her into someone who never really left, someone who stayed loyal, someone whose entire identity still centers around the same man. It turns survival into devotion. It turns distance into faithfulness. It turns a complicated, painful story into something cleaner, something easier. Something that protects the man at the center of it all. Because if she comes back willingly, then nothing that happened before has to be reckoned with. And that's not an accident. That benefits a system where women are not the point. A system where their stories don't need to be preserved in full. Because in that system, being a wife is the story. That's the role. That's the function. And that is exactly what these stories are teaching, because they are not just telling history. They are shaping expectation. They are showing women how to exist inside that system. Stories like Sarah teach patience, endurance, wait your turn. Stories like Hagar teach obedience, submission, stay in your place even when it hurts. And stories like Keturah, they teach something quieter. If you are faithful to the system, if you do what is asked of you, you will expand. You will grow. You will produce something that lasts. That is the promise. That is the pitch. That is what these stories are offering women. And it has been working for a very long time, because this isn't just about ancient texts. This is about how we remember, how we center, how we decide which women become the story and which one fades into the background. Modern parallel. These stories, as I've said, don't stay in scripture. They don't stay on those pages. They show up in our everyday lives. Because we still do this. We still decide which relationship becomes the story and which one fades into the background. When Gene Wilder died, people flooded the internet with tributes, and almost all of them centered on Gilda Radner. Their love story had become part of cultural memory. It was the one people held on to, the one people repeated, the one people felt. But here's the part people don't sit with. Gene Wilder was married to Gilda Radner for about 5 years before she died. And that relationship became legendary. It became the story, the one people never let go of. But Gene Wilder had another wife, Karen Boyer. They married in 1991 and they stayed married for 25 years. 25 years, not a short chapter, not a passing relationship, a life, a shared life. She was the woman who was there in the quiet years, the years that don't get turned into movies or headlines, the years where love looks less like intensity and more like presence, consistency, care. And when Gene Wilder began to decline, it was Karen who was there. He died in 2016 from complications related to Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's is not gentle. It does not just take a person at the end. It takes them slowly, piece by piece, memory by memory. It changes how they speak, how they think, how they recognize the very people they love. It can take away recognition. It can take away personality. It can take away the ability to connect in the ways that once came naturally. And the people who love them have to watch that happen. They have to stay. They have to care. They have to love someone who is in many ways slipping away while still physically present. That is not a romanticized love story. That is a hard one. That is a real one. And that is the love Karen Boyer lived inside. She was the one caring for him, staying with him, loving him through that decline, through the confusion, through the loss, through the long goodbye that Alzheimer's creates. And when he died, people could not even remember her name. They went back to the story they had already decided mattered. Earlier love, the more dramatic love, the one that had already been written into memory. And the woman who was actually there at the end disappeared in the telling. Not because she didn't matter, but because she wasn't the story people chose to keep. And that's the same pattern, the same instinct, the same way of remembering. One relationship becomes everything. The others become invisible. And the people living inside those quieter, longer, more complicated stories are left out of the version that survives. The Institute of Marriage. So now we've talked about her. We've said her name, Keturah. We've looked at why she was written into the story. We've looked at what her body produced. We've looked at how young she likely was and how old Abraham was when she was given to him. We've walked through her sons and the nations that came from them. We've traced the way her life was used to build connections, trade routes, relationships, power. We've watched her be remembered only in fragments, if she is remembered at all. And what that shows us is something very clear. Women in these stories were used inside marriage, and marriage itself was part of a system that built lineage, a system that secured inheritance, a system that connected families, tribes, land, and power. Marriage was political. Marriage was economical. Marriage was structural. And women were not gently placed into that system. They were traded, they were negotiated, they were exchanged. There was a bride price, later dowries. Women were part of the transaction. And that is the part we are not taught to sit with. Because that system did not center women, it controlled them. It moved them. It used them to build something larger than themselves. That's what we're actually looking at when we read her story. And then something shifts because over time the world changes. Women begin to gain access to things they didn't have before: money, work, independence, the ability to exist outside of a man's household. And when that starts to happen, the institution of marriage loses some of its original leverage, some of its original appeal, and no longer has the same built-in necessity. So it has to be rebranded, repackaged, resold. And now instead of being presented as structure, it's presented as destiny, as love, as fulfillment, as the ultimate goal. And we see that everywhere. In fairy tales, in Disney movies, in reality shows like Love is Blind and Married at First Sight. In the constant message that a woman's life is leading toward one moment: being chosen, being married, being claimed. And it doesn't even start in adulthood. It starts when we are kids. My aunt is an author in the young adult genre. And if you've ever read those books or watched those movies, you start to notice a pattern. Everything builds toward one moment. Prom. That's the climax. That's the big event. That's the night everything is supposed to come together. The dress, the date, the reveal, the validation. And if you stop and think about it, prom is to teenagers what a wedding is to adults. It's the same structure, the same buildup, the same message. You have been chosen, you are desired, you have arrived. They start selling it to us early before we even understand what we are being taught to want. Because if they don't keep selling it, women might start seeing it for what it is. They might start to recognize the marketing, the packaging, the story they've been handed since they were little girls. And once that recognition sets in, you don't just sit with it. You start pushing back. You start asking for something different because every story we're given still centers men. Even when a woman is the main character, her story usually bends back toward a man, a love interest, a relationship, a validation point, something that says her story isn't complete on its own. And when we finally get something different, like Brave, a redheaded girl, no love interest, her story centered on herself, people lose their ever-loving minds. They panic. When Brave came out, they speculated. They tried to figure out what was wrong with her, because how dare a story exist where a woman is the center and it doesn't end in a man? That reaction tells you everything because it exposes the expectation. Women are supposed to be moving toward marriage, toward partnership, toward being chosen. And if they're not, something must be wrong. So no, we don't just sit here and analyze these stories. We don't just nod and say, that's how it was. We start recognizing the pattern. We start calling it what it is. We are being marketed to. We are being sold something. And it is time to stop buying it. It is time to demand stories where women are the center, not because of who they marry, not because of who they love, but because they exist, because they think, because they choose, because they live full, complete stories that do not orbit around a man. Because until we do that, we're still living inside the same system, just with better packaging. Personal story. And this is where my Aunt Zelly comes in. I was about 5 years old. My sister Christine was 9. We were sitting in my Aunt Zelly's living room in Florida. The room was full of adults, my mother, my father, my Aunt Zelly, my Uncle Bill, my grandpa, one of my older siblings somewhere in the mix, though I don't even remember what they were doing. And then there was me and my sister Christine. Everybody was talking over each other. Different conversations happening at the same time. It was loud, full, busy. And my sister and I were sitting quietly, behaving, because that's what was expected of us. And Aunt Sally, she couldn't follow any of it. There were too many voices, too many conversations happening at once. So instead of trying to keep up with the adults, she turned to us, just us. And Aunt Zelly was already old when I knew her. She had to be close to 80. She had lived a whole life by that point, seen things, experienced things, made choices most women in her generation were never even told they could make. And out of the blue, just like that, she said, "You don't need a man for anything. If you want a ring, you can get yourself a ring. You want a house? You can get yourself a house. You don't need a man for anything." And that stuck with me. Not because I fully understood it at 5 years old, but because it was different from everything else I would come to hear. And here's the part that always makes me pause. When she turned 100 years old, she got married for the first time in her life to the man I called Uncle Bill. Now, some people hear that and they want to turn it into a love story like, see, she found someone in the end. And that's not what this was. They were both very old. He was around 90. His health wasn't good. And they both understood something very practical. If they got married and one of them died, the other could receive the Social Security. That's it. That was the reason. It wasn't romance. It wasn't some lifelong dream finally coming true. It was two people looking at the system and deciding to use it in a way that might benefit them. A decision, an agreement on their terms. But after 6 months, he died. 6 months. And because the marriage had been so short, she didn't qualify for the benefits she thought she would receive. Even then, even when she stepped into the system on her own terms, even when she used it exactly the way it was designed to be used, it still didn't deliver what it promised. And that's the part that stays with me. Because the woman who told 2 little girls, "You don't need a man for anything," never bought into what they were selling. Not when she was young, not when she was old, not even when she chose to step into it for practical reasons. She wasn't fooled by it. She wasn't shaped by it. She wasn't living her life trying to reach it. And that brings us back to Keturah. Because Keturah didn't get that choice. She didn't get to step in or step out. She didn't get to decide the terms. Her life was used by the system. Return to Keturah. So now we come back to her. Keturah. Her name means incense, fragrance, something that fills a space quietly, something that settles into the air, something that gets into your clothes, your hair, your skin, and stays with you long after the flame is gone. And maybe that's what she was trying to tell us all along, who she was, why she mattered. Because the text doesn't stay with her, it moves on quickly. It gives her a name, it gives her sons, and then it leaves. But what comes from her doesn't leave. Her descendants move across the map through trade routes, neighboring nations, through conflict, through connection, through generations that continue to shape the world the Bible is telling. Keturah, incense. Her legacy lived on just like her fragrance, spreading out, reaching further than anyone standing in that moment could have imagined. She lingers even when the story doesn't. And maybe she also wanted us to understand something else, something harder, that marriage in her world was never about her. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about fulfillment. It wasn't about her becoming something whole. It was about contracts, negotiations, property. And women were the property. Keturah had no choice. She lived inside a system that was built without her in mind, a system that used her, a system that needed her, a system that never centered her. But women like my Aunt Zelly, they saw it. They resisted it. They refused to be sold the idea that their life had to move in that direction. And because of women like her, women like us have more choices. And that's the difference. Keturah reminds us what marriage was. A contract between men, a system of exchange, a structure built on lineage and power. And she also reminds us you don't have to buy into it. You don't have to build your life around it. You don't have to measure your worth by it. Because her story didn't end with her disappearance. It expanded, it spread, it reached across generations. And in that way, she was never small. She was never insignificant. She was never just a footnote. She was something that carried forward, something that stayed, something that lingered. And her fragrance still reaches us now. And that's today's anti-sermon. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to like, comment, rate, or review the podcast. It really helps more people find the show. And if you'd like to support the podcast financially, check out my link tree in the show notes. There are several ways you can support the show and the work that I do. You can also find me on TikTok and YouTube. I am Crystal J, Crystaljae. And remember, I'm Nice Lady.